Chapter 44, Ecology and the Biosphere. This is our introductory chapter to the division of biology that deals with the living world and how it interacts with the non-living world. So for this, a bit of introduction to some terms. Here, if we look at levels of study, we can see from the most defined level of study, we have an individual organism. If we take organisms of the same type and we put them together, then we have a population. If we then take all of the living things within a given area, that's what we call a community. And then we can take a look at the living communities as well as the non-living components of the communities. We call that an ecosystem. If we take all the ecosystems on planet Earth, put them together, we call that the biosphere. Now, if we take a look at some of the branches of ecology, we see some various names. So organismal ecology looks at how particular individuals are suited to live in their living place or habitat. Also, population ecology, now we look at a number of individuals. So this is looking at more specifics. This is looking at a group of individuals and how that population might be altered by events. We can then look at community. So now we're looking at interactions between different species. This is looking at just a single species. Here we're looking at interactions between different species. And a lot of food web study comes into this level. And then finally, ecosystem ecology, where we pull in not only the living organisms, but also the non-living components of an area, the nutrients, the weather, the soil, the water, etc. Here's an example of organismal ecology. This particular butterfly, the Kerner blue butterfly, is a very rare butterfly and endangered in some regions because it only lives in certain areas that have lupine plants. Lupine is a type of plant that produces a bluish purple flower, and this butterfly will only live in those areas. It does happen to be the state butterfly for the state of New Hampshire, which is our neighbor to the north. So when we look at biogeography, biogeography is where we are looking at how living things are placed out in the non-living world, in the geographic map of the Earth and the biosphere. So we're going to take a look at a term called abiotic factors. So remember, anytime we put an A in front of a word, we negate that word. Biotic means the living factors, the living components. Abiotic would be the non-living components. And this is going to vary greatly. Things like temperature and rainfall, land and soil, etc. All these kinds of things are going to have an impact on the biotic world. Within our biomes, which we're going to talk about next, which are regional areas, we see that we may have an endemic species. This is a species that is only found in a specific geographic area, kind of like that Kerner blue butterfly. And that area is very restricted. So that organism is uniquely suited to that particular area. So we have here the marsupial, the kangaroo, which is only found in Australia. This is a species that the rest of the world, as the continents broke up, was found not to have a survival advantage, but because it was sequestered on the Australian continent, this area became the home to this particular animal, and it's uniquely suited. Now, there are other species that we call generalists, like this Rattus norvegicus, which is the brown rat, originally from Norway, but has found its way around the world and is able to live anywhere, essentially, from the sewers of New York City to the lands of Australia, which is difficult for the endemic species because when these species come in, they can take over an area, and that makes it harder for these endemic species to survive and thrive. So let's take a look at some of these abiotic factors, non-living factors. We have energy sources. So all living things need energy. Plants and photosynthetic organisms can use sunlight to create their own food. There is also in aquatic biotic areas, we have something called ocean upwelling. This happens in freshwater as well, where there's a cycling of the water based on temperature, which helps bring nutrients up from the bottom of the aquatic area. Temperature is very important. It will dictate what animals can live in what area. It also impacts things like migration and hibernation or movement of living organisms. Presence, type, and changes in the water. So we'll see in just a little bit, there are particular ecosystems, biomes that are made up of freshwater, saltwater, there's frozen water, and then there's seasonal water changes, frozen water, which is ice. And then nutrients and inorganic materials. So this is materials that living things require. So nutrients often are made of carbon, and they are requirements for living things, but there's also some inorganic materials that are required for living organisms, like nitrogen and phosphorus. Nitrogen being a key factor for making proteins and phosphorus being a key factor for making genetic material like DNA and RNA. So other factors in the aquatic realm, the amount of oxygen, very important, that's dissolved in the water, the salinity or the salt level, the currents, the tides, etc. On terrestrial biomes, some very important abiotic factors are fire and wind. You may think these to be devastating, but several biomes require both of these. And then for both terrestrial and aquatic, they can be impacted by volcanism, tectonics or plate movements, and other natural events. So I mentioned before this ocean upwelling, and this can be an important process that helps bring nutrients up from the lower depths of a water body, be it an ocean, or this happens also in freshwater. So when living organisms, aquatic organisms die, they sink to the bottom and degrade, so the nutrients remain down here in the lower regions of the water body. So it is important to have those nutrients brought up to the surface. So this can happen at the coastline via something called upwelling, where wind comes off of the land, and as the wind pushes waves, that draws the lower water up and around and brings those nutrients up into the upper layers where we find living organisms that can utilize them. There's also seasonal changes in lakes. So here we have winter, spring, summer, fall, and we see that in winter we have ice formation in regions that do get cold enough for ice, and we see a more uniform water temperature. Then in spring we see that the water starts to warm, and there's a very unique happening at 4 degrees Celsius. So at 4 degrees Celsius, this is the maximum density of water molecules, their interactions with each other. When water is at 0 degrees, it's actually less dense than liquid water, and so it floats. But at 4 degrees, it's more dense and it sinks. So the cold water sinks, and this helps push up more nutrients up into the water column. In the summer, we see a stratification and a great increase in water temperature. These are all measured in Celsius because that is the scientific measurement. And then in fall, we see a similar turnover. We see that the temperatures start dropping. They start dropping, and this causes the warmer waters around the cooler waters to cause this similar type of upwelling. As I mentioned, in terrestrial ecosystems, fire, the abiotic impact of fire can be very important. There's some plants that are very adapted to requiring fire to open structures like their cones. So they can't complete or germinate their reproductive cycle unless there are seasonal fires. So let's move on and talk about some of the terrestrial biomes. Here we see a map of the continents, and we see a listing of the different types of major biomes across the continent. The ones that I have placed stars next to, these are biomes that you need to know, and you need to know basically where they're located on a map of the continents. Here we see they're color-coded, and keep in mind that the equator is not written in here, but it runs like right about there. So that's where we find the equator. And I'll have this posted as we go through the subsequent slides. So we'll start off with the first one you're required to know. There's 8 total land biomes. The tropical forest. So this, as far as temperature, relatively hot, 25 to 30 degrees Celsius, and it's considered a forest. There's heavy plant growth year-round, very diverse animal species, and high productivity, which results not only from the higher temperatures, but also a high precipitation or rainfall of greater than 250 centimeters per year. Also, there's constant day length around the equator. So this is in green, and we notice that around the equator, we're going to have constant day length, and that's not going to change with the seasons. So this is a very, very productive ecosystem. We then move on to the savanna, which is a grassland, and we call these the hot grasslands, 24 to 29 degrees Celsius. Moderate precipitation, so much less than the rainforest, but this rain is very seasonal. So there are rainy periods and dry periods. So the savanna is shown in this kind of a whitish area here, kind of just outside of the tropical rainforests, but on many different continents we do find them. There's few trees, so a few low trees, but predominant grasslands. We have lots of herbivores and large carnivores, which are going to predominate in this biome. We then move on to the desert. So in the desert, we have hot days, greater than 60 degrees Celsius, but often cool nights, very low precipitation, less than 30 centimeters per year. This leads to limited plant growth and animal diversity. You're not going to find amphibians in the desert because it's just too dry for them. So we see that the deserts are in the tan, located here, 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 and even in North America. And again, limited plant growth and animal diversity. We then move on to the chaparral, which is called the scrub forest. So it is considered a forest. It's warm, 18 to 38 degrees Celsius, moderate precipitation. So not as high as the rainforest, but certainly higher than some other biomes, 65 to 75 centimeters per year. Again, seasonal with hot and dry summers. Lots of shrubby plant growth. So often along coastlines, we find it in the Mediterranean and California. So the chaparral is this blue color. We see some also. Here's the Mediterranean, here's California. We also see some at the tip of Africa and some out here in Australia. And periodic fires are essential to this biome. It's a requirement for a lot of the success of this biome. So while in California they have a lot of problems with fires because people have decided they want to live in this area, but fire is a very natural part of this biome. Next is the temperate grassland. Temperate means moderate, and we see that there are moderate temperatures and moderate precipitation. Cool, minus 20 to 30 degrees, not minus 30, but minus 20 to 30 degrees, so a very wide range. These are grasslands or prairies. They have cold winters and warm summers, not hot summers. North Africa and Eurasia is a very common place for this temperate grassland in the peach color. Little bit in South America. Few trees and many large herbivores are found in this biome. The temperate forest, again, moderate temperatures, minus 30 to 30 degrees Celsius. This is considered a forest, so lots of trees. And the tree type are the deciduous trees that lose their leaves during the winter. We find this in North America, Western Europe, Eastern Asia, Chile, and New Zealand. So the temperate forest is in the lighter peach colors. And a moderately high precipitation, 75 to 150 centimeters per year. And it's an even amount of rain through the year, so it's not seasonal, or not just rain, but could be snowfall. So even precipitation. The boreal forest, or the taiga, the boreal forest. So this has a lot of low-lying plants and coniferous forests, or pines, evergreens. Cool to cold, minus 60 to 15 degrees Celsius. So cold winters and cool summers. They don't get terribly warm. Canada, Alaska, Russia, Northern Europe. So we find the boreal forest up here in the yellow. Lots of evergreen trees, many large herbivores, few amphibians and reptiles, because it's getting a little bit cold for them. Remember, these guys are ectotherms, and they require a environmental temperature that can sustain them. So moderately high precipitation, 40 to 100 centimeters per year, but mostly as snow in these biomes. And the tundra. The tundra is located in the Arctic regions. Cold, that should say cold, not cool, minus 34 to 12 degrees Celsius, very little vegetation, cold winters, and very short, only about 10 weeks of summer, short cold summer in the Arctic regions. That's this reddish color. Low precipitation, 15 to 25 centimeters per year. We have something called permafrost, where just a little bit below the topsoil becomes permanently frozen year-round, so even during summer. That's why you can't have a lot of trees because, or actually no trees, and very low plants because they can't extend their roots down very deep. This area experiences 24 hours of sunlight per day in summer, so no darkness. Some large herbivores and carnivores live in this area, like elk and reindeer, carnivores, polar bears, wolves, etc. Now we move on to the aquatic biomes. Two major divisions, marine or saltwater and freshwater. And within those, we can subdivide into ocean, intertidal, coral reef, estuaries for the marine, and for the freshwater, lakes and ponds, rivers and streams, and wetlands, which are marshes and swamps. So we take a look first at ocean and intertidal. There's a number of different regions, and many of these same region names will be true for freshwater as well. So these are based on depth. So we see that the oceanic zone, the part that's ocean, runs here, and then there is the neritic zone, which is in between the open ocean and the intertidal zone. So this is where there's constant water, but it's not very deep. We get into the oceanic zone when it's more than 200 meters deep. So the intertidal zone is where there are high and low tides. This neritic zone is an area of high biotic life because of the fact that it's not very deep. We get into the oceanic zone. We have the photic zone. So photic means light can still penetrate the water. The aphotic, we're not going to get any light into this region. And the abysmal zone, this is very, very deep. So you're going to find only very unique forms of life here that do not need any light and can exist in very cold temperatures. Also during this area, there may be regions of hot vents that can help support life. So this region in the dark blue is called the benthic realm. The benthic realm. This runs along the bottom of the ocean. It's cool to cold, but it's very nutrient rich because remember, as living organisms die, they fall to the bottom and they decompose here. Okay. Also in this abysmal region, there's very high pressures, which can be very hard for certain living organisms. They have to be able to adapt to those high pressures. So in this intertidal zone, we see in the picture that we have sea stars and urchins. There can also be crabs and snails that live in this area. This intertidal zone is what we call the beach. It's between the high and the low tide, and it can have lots of living life forms, but the living things must be able to survive a dry period between the tides. So they must be adapted for that. Now, another region of ocean is called the coral reefs, which are made up of the exoskeletons, the calcium exoskeleton of coral, which is a Cnidaria species. They're found 30 degrees north or south of the equator, so generally warm waters. They're home not only to the coral species, but it allows for lots of living space for many, many other species. So they're very rich in diversity, protists, plants, and animals. But it's an incredibly delicate ecosystem and very sensitive to pollutants. And if the coral dies, so these other living species lose their home. And then the last marine biome is called an estuary. This is called brackish water, where fresh water, here we have a river that is meeting the ocean. So and the tides will bring in salt water. So there's a mixing of fresh and salt water. These are important breeding grounds for many species. So many species spend their lives in the ocean, but come into these brackish waters or even up into fresh water to breed. So these are very, very important breeding grounds. We move on to the freshwater. We have lakes and ponds. So they have some of the same layers as the ocean, for example, the photic and the aphotic regions, as well as that benthic region where it's very nutrient rich on the bottom of the lake. Now, lakes can become easily polluted from toxic runoff from local living areas, primarily from humans. They also can have seasonal algal blooms, which can come from other living species such as birds and their fecal matter, causing an increased amount of nitrogen and phosphorus in the water, or pollutants such as soaps, which often contain phosphorus. And these cause the algae levels to go way up and utilize a lot of the oxygen in the water. Once the oxygen is out of the water, fish and other organisms have no oxygen on which to survive. We then have rivers and streams. So a river is a bigger stream, but they are running water biomes. So the water is constantly moving. It can be slow or fast, and it heads towards a lake or an ocean. The source is usually cold water, often from snowmelt, and it is the home for many fish, worms, plants, and protists such as algae. And then our final aquatic biome are the wetlands. These are marshes and swamps. Here the soil is permanently wet, always wet. There's shallow bodies of water that might dry out. So they may look fairly dry, but the soil is still always wet during the dry season. The water may become stagnant with low oxygen levels and high decomposition from the bacteria and the fungi that live here. So sometimes these areas can be a little stinky, but this low productivity, meaning low life forms that live in the water, is often due to the low oxygen and nitrogen, because these are used up by the bacteria and the fungi that are decomposing in the area. Now let's talk just a little bit about global climate change. This is an area that up until recently was often discounted by politicians and even some scientists, but it's hard to now ignore the science, which is saying that we are under a worldwide increase in temperature due to rising levels of atmospheric carbon dioxide. Here are some of the areas of study around global climate change. And one thing to take into account is that there is a difference between the term climate and weather. And this is where often there's a lot of controversy, because individuals may say, well, we had a very cold winter, so therefore their global climate change can't be real. Well, weather refers to conditions during a short period of time, like this past winter was very cold or very warm. But climate is a long-term predictable weather ability or atmospheric conditions. So here we have long-term, and you can predict what it's going to be. Weather is short-term, may be variable. So how do we gather evidence that climate change has actually happened? Well, there has been studies using ice cores that if you look at the ice, you can go back in time 400,000 years. And because of the quality of the ice and the thickness of the layers, you can indirectly measure temperature. You can indirectly measure, yes, temperature over time. And you can also take these samples and measure the carbon dioxide, which was dissolved into that ice, and find out what the carbon dioxide levels were atmospherically at the time. So when we map these out, and here we have temperature change over time from 400,000 years ago, and CO2 levels over time 400,000 years ago to today, we see that as we see an increase in carbon dioxide, and it does fluctuate over time, we see then an increase in temperature that follows. And it's very, very readily reproducible. And if we look at our carbon dioxide levels, look at the current time, and it is definitely increasing, and therefore we're seeing an increase in temperature. Now, if we look at more recently, don't go back 400,000 years, we only go back 50 or 60 years, look at the dramatic increase in carbon dioxide levels over this time. So this is a dramatic increase in carbon dioxide levels since industrialization. We call this the greenhouse effect because what happens is with increasing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the sun's rays come in, and there's all kinds of rays in the sun, one of which is infrared. The infrared rays cannot be redirected back out into the atmosphere. A certain percentage of them stays trapped. It gets trapped by the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, so therefore the temperature goes up around the planet. This has led to an increase in global temperature, and we see a loss in glacial ice. This is 1938. This is the Grinnell Glacier, and we see a loss of this glacier over time. These are the same pictures taken over time, and the glacier is going away. So where is this water going? The water is going into the oceans, which means the oceans are rising, coastal areas are receding, we're losing coastland, and it's changing seasonal water supplies and affecting local ecosystems. So we will continue to talk more about this in our subsequent chapters.